Good afternoon, and welcome to the January 11th GMC membership meeting. I'm David Lubar, Chair of the GMC. For over 70 years, the GMC has convened business and community leaders in a nonpartisan way to collaboratively assess and address the challenges our community faces in an effort to make Milwaukee a better place to live, work, and play. Last week, we were shocked by the events that occurred in our nation's capital. We will hear today from keynote speaker Bob Feldman, founder of the Dialogue Project, about the critical role the business community can play in improving civil discourse and reducing polarization. However, before our keynote, we have some guest speakers and GMC program updates. So I'd like to begin today's membership meeting by first introducing GMC member and former chairman, John Daniels. John is chairman emeritus of Quarles and Brady, and he will introduce Lynell Ramey, our first speaker. John, I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks, David, and Happy New Year to everyone. And it's a pleasure to be with folks, even if it is virtual. I think we have a very nice presentation today that will be very helpful to a number of the businesses in our community. I think we all know from our own life's experiences that outside of our family, there are other things that accelerate our growth as people. You know, more recently, it's sort of come out under the moniker of mentoring, and those subjects have taken on a whole life of their own around our country. So it was great in 2016 when the Public Policy Forum did a deep dive in Milwaukee relative to how we could do this better. Not to develop a one-size-fits-all, but to figure out ways that we could do this much more effectively. So kudos to the Public Policy Forum, Milwaukee Public Schools, the Milwaukee Bucks, and others who have led the way on finding ways for us to help youngsters be much more effective to grow and develop in our community. For me, it's always about the personal message. So I want to share with you two personal messages from organizations that are close to the GMC, and indeed from some members of the GMC. The first relates to Ralph Holman, who many of us know was a longtime executive director of the Milwaukee Urban League. Ralph is a graduate of the Milwaukee public school system and was a true leader in many ways in our city. One of the conversations I had with Ralph, however, he mentioned to me that a real star was a coach of his by the name of Bob Harris. Bob was a football coach at North Division in Milwaukee. But what was more important, Bob was mentor to many, many folks who ultimately gave back to our community in very, very special ways. Some of them are better known, such as former Brigadier General Robert Colcroft, or the Lilly Foundation executive, Dr. Sam Cargile. All of these folks came out of Milwaukee public schools, but none of them would have arisen to where they did without Bob Harris. And Ralph shared that story, and he shared it many times with others. I also want to share with you another example of the impact of mentoring that I personally observed over the last decade. And that relates to our own Skip Polliner, who I watched take under his guidance while at Northwestern Mutual, a young man at Rufus King High School. Youngster went on to be a Phi Beta Kappa graduate at Morehouse, on to the University of Wisconsin Law School. And now, most important to me, he's back in Milwaukee with one of our major enterprises. So we know that mentoring works, and we know that finding ways to effectively do it in each of our organizations can have a great impact. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Lynell Ramey, a mentor Greater Milwaukee, who, as many of you know, is a former executive of the Boys and Girls Club, and for Mary Ellen Stanek, a double graduate of Marquette University. Linnell?
John, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And first and foremost, I appreciate the invite to be here today with GMC. Attorney Daniels was one of my professional mentors. So thank you for that great introduction about Mentor Greater Milwaukee and the power of mentoring itself. So I'm going to be amongst you all very short, but enough to just let you know who we are, what we do, and hopefully how long-term we can partner. Mentor Greater Milwaukee, as John mentioned, really was sparked back in a study that was done in 2016 with the whole idea around how do we make sure that we can support mentoring organizations throughout Greater Milwaukee by providing not only professional development and training, but one-on-one technical assistance, regardless if the organization serves 20,000 kids a year or if they only work with 100 kids a year. So I think it's very important to kind of talk a little bit more what we can do. Heather, am I controlling the slides? I'm not showing any movement on my end. But we can just skip to the next slide if someone else has control. Thank you. Here's our mission. Our mission for Mentor Greater Milwaukee, very simply, is increasing mentoring relationships by building the capacity of existing as well as new mentoring organizations to match a caring adult with children in need through safe, effective mentoring programs throughout Greater Milwaukee. Next slide, please. Here's our 4 priorities that we have. The very first thing is, how do we work closely with organizations to help them build capacity? And we do that very simply by providing a series of trainings and technical assistance, really grounded in evidence-based approaches. Again, the key is to ensure whether an organization is only serving, say, 100 kids a year, if they're a new organization, say company-based, or if they're serving 25,000 kids a year. We want all of our young people who are receiving mentorship to feel confident structures in place. So the other thing is, how do we expand the mentor base? So how do we get a wide variety of public and private stakeholders to be involved in mentoring? The key that I like to say is everyone who is willing to share their story and be vulnerable can become a mentor. Doesn't really mean your background should dictate certain things. As the Ralph Holman story talked about, being a coach in high school had a huge impact on Ralph's life. So there's a variety of ways that people can get involved, and we want to help lead that and find ways to do that for them. Next slide, please. The other thing is, how do we make sure that we're sharing the right data with the community to show that mentoring truly works? Right now, 1 in 3 young people are without a mentor. But a lot of times we know mentoring works. The key is, how do we tell the story and then make sure those other young people without a mentor can have a mentor in their life? And then finally, how do we make sure we expand the investment in mentoring? What Mentor Greater Milwaukee does is support current organizations. So we want to make sure that we're uplifting what they do in the community and making sure that we're able to be a resource for those mentoring organizations throughout Milwaukee. Next slide, please. Support for mentoring, it gets the job done. As John mentioned earlier, we know that when a young person has a positive person in their life who is standing alongside of them, they traditionally do better across every statistical data point there is. Young people who have a mentor in their life are less likely than their peers to skip school, 52% more or less likely. Also, a young person who has a mentor in their life is 55% more likely to just enroll in college. And we know that graduation rates from college increases when that mentor continues to stay with them, as evidence as we've seen in programs such as MKE Fellows and All In Milwaukee. And one of the best data points that I love is when a young person has a mentor, they're 130% more likely to hold a leadership position. And that's usually just because a mentor in a young person's life helps builds the confidence and helps that young person feel more empowered to stand up and be a leader in their community. Next slide, please. So what's the call to action? What are we asking here today? 1, partner with us at Mentor Greater Milwaukee. But 1, allowing us to talk more about recruitment opportunities. Where can people be mentors at, and how do we prepare them to be the mentors by allowing us to come and provide certain training for employees? I like to say the foundation of mentoring. So when someone decides that they want to become a mentor with MKE Fellows, All In Milwaukee, Boys and Girls Clubs of Big Brothers Big Sisters, they have an idea what that should look like, And so they don't walk into being a mentor being blind. And the other thing is, what about branding opportunities for Mentor Greater Milwaukee? How do we uplift opportunities for Mentor Greater Milwaukee to spread the knowledge about the good that mentoring offers for young people throughout our community? And the other thing is there ways that your company can consider a time off policy for mentoring for employees? I know a lot of companies currently offer opportunities for their employees to volunteer out in the community, but is there a way to be very specific and focused in on mentoring young people in the community, whether that's with our school systems or one of the great programs that we have? Next slide, please. So you asked, what kind of training opportunities are there? Well, here's just a couple that we have done with some of the companies here throughout Milwaukee. One is our first one that we call Mentoring One-on-One. It's really the basic principles around mentoring and how we can really talk about the philosophy of having a mentoring mindset and what that can look like. The next one we've done, in particular over the past year, when we've seen a lot of cultural competency needed within mentoring. And really it talks about how do we talk about eliminating explicit biases when working as a mentor, and talk about and navigate through what that can look like and being culturally relevant and knowledgeable before working with your young person. And then finally, mentoring in the workplace. Many of you may have internship programs that are for college students or even high school students. How can we help you expand what that can look like and make it more so a mentor mindset program versus just an employment program? So those are some ways that we like to say we can work with you all, just a couple, but there's others that we can even cater very specifically to your company. Next slide, please. We know, here's just some examples of why mentoring the workplace is so important. One, helping employment engagement and satisfaction, and of course, retention. We can also talk about cultivating and developing the future workforce by being able to offer mentoring mindset programming for young people. It's expanding a vibrant community by having your employees not only working with young people, but then those young people are potential future customers or viable customers as well. And not to mention, how do you can align your corporate strength with the corporate mentoring engagement strategy that you want to have. And then improving your public image and community relations as well is a great way to have mentoring in your workplace. Next slide, please. Here's how you can reach us. Here's my email and our phone number and our website. Our best way of communicating is just directly to us and us having a conversation with you all about what is it that we can do to help you, whether you're interested in creating your own mentoring program at your company, or if you want to find out ways to get your employees engaged with other organizations throughout Milwaukee. So thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate it. This is an awesome opportunity for Mentor Greater Milwaukee, and I'm hoping there's something we can do and offer you all as an organization to help build the mentoring mindset and continue to uplift mentoring throughout Milwaukee. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Linnell. Especially this is National Mentor Month, so this is a great way to kick off the month. And we want to thank you and John for your continued leadership in both mentoring and introducing opportunities and resources to future leaders. The GMC is very proud to be working with John on the Milwaukee Fellows Initiative, which provides intern opportunities for young Black men in our community and creates access to a business and a leadership network they would not have had without the fellows. Alive currently runs the program under John Daniels III's leadership. So Happy New Year all. As chaotic as 2020 was, the GMC remained focused on the significant needs and inequities in our community. And we continue to work within our three focus areas of economic prosperity, innovation and talent, and vibrancy of place. And we've recently added the goal of becoming an anti-racist organization. 2020 brought about the pandemic pivot for all of our programs. First, in innovation and talent, we responded to the shortage of corporate internship opportunities with our virtual internship program, which served 120 students. 50% of these students were people of color. 30% were first-generation college students. This program has created an equitable space for interns to connect with Milwaukee area companies and build a career network. We also wrapped up the inaugural Forward 48 class, creating a robust and diverse civic leadership succession strategy through experiential learning, professional development, and exclusive networking opportunities. Much like our virtual internship program, Forward 48 provides access and opportunity for emerging leaders of color to find an equitable future in Milwaukee. The impact of the program runs deep within the cohort. One participant shared that Forward 48 was just what I needed. They organized engaging conversations with local leaders, facilitated insightful discussions, and brought together some of the most thoughtful and compassionate people I've ever met. The diversity in thought was extremely refreshing. I look forward to continuing to build relationships. Our economic prosperity work helps small businesses grow, especially businesses owned by people of color. When the COVID pandemic hit, there was uncertainty about what would happen within our existing small business community. The Scale Up team assisted companies through this challenging time by creating access to resources. We helped small business owners navigate the PPP loan process and tackle the digital divide issue that confronted many small business owners as we transitioned to a virtual world. While the pandemic's timing forced us to postpone the Growth Accelerator, we were able to host a virtual Spark cohort working with women and minority-owned businesses with revenue under $1 million in what could be arguably called the most connected cohort to date. Entrepreneurs of color own 67% of the Spark companies, and Scale Up's ability to bring equitable resources and opportunities to these entrepreneurs is vital to their success. Scale Up staff directly consulted with these businesses to help them find the best way to succeed during the pandemic. So we look forward to incorporating what we've learned into the Growth Accelerator and the Spark cohorts in 2021. Probably one of the most difficult of our initiatives to pivot to virtual is Milwaukee United. It's a collaboration of the City of Milwaukee, the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, LISC Milwaukee, the Urban League, and the Greater Milwaukee Committee. 4 years ago, we created a strategic action agenda for the downtown Milwaukee and the adjacent neighborhoods, formed with residents' inputs to determine each neighborhood's need. In 2019, Milwaukee United created the Anti-Displacement Fund. It's one of 2 such funds in the country, and it's helped more than 110 homeowners stay in their homes, preventing gentrification due to rapidly rising property values and taxes in historically disinvested neighborhoods. With $500,000 of private funding, we launched the second round of the Anti-Displacement Fund recruitment, which ended last week. As of today, we've approved 111 homeowners in round 2 with more applications pending. And this past week, we were pleased to present our progress on Milwaukee United and the Anti-Displacement Fund to a cohort of 12 cities: Brookings Institute, the Aspen Institute, the Urban Institute, and the Kresge Foundation. Milwaukee United continues to be a strong partner of LISC Milwaukee's Brew City Match, pairing vacant retail locations in commercial corridors with small businesses. Brew City Match is prepping for round 4 in spring 2021. During the pandemic that caused so much uncertainty for small businesses, this program supports and sustains the growth of Milwaukee United's neighborhoods commercial corridors. It's been a fun journey to see Spark graduates who are now a part of Brew City Match and creating a vibrant retail corridor and employment in their neighborhood. And in Vibrancy of Place, we're excited to share that the Beerline Trail Linear Park Expansion's feasibility study has begun. It was initially scheduled for 2020 and postponed due to COVID. The feasibility study is the first step in a comprehensive campaign for the creation of a mile-long linear park along the trail in Harambe. Green spaces and parks have been a lifeline for many of us during these COVID times. Join us on January 19th for a program on how creating equitable community green spaces increases the prosperity, physical and mental health for all neighborhoods. Equity Green Spaces in the Beerline Trail features keynote speaker Carol Coletta. I think many of you know Carol. She's a national thought leader on creative placemaking and equity. She's a senior fellow for the Kresge Foundation's American Cities program and is president and CEO of the Memphis River Parks Partnership. Following her presentation, a panel of local leaders and creative placemaking experts will discuss equity and the importance of these spaces within our communities. The panel includes Mayor Tom Barrett, County Executive David Crowley, Riverworks Development Corporation Executive Director Daryl Johnson, and Wisconsin Department of Transportation Secretary Craig Thompson. And there is still time to submit a nomination for the 8th Annual Mary Ellen Stanek Award for Diversity in Corporate Governance. This prestigious award is given to an individual or entity exhibiting leadership, influence, and impact, resulting in increased diversity on corporate boards in our region. And as you can note, the award is named after Mary Ellen Stanek, Managing Director and Chief Investment Officer of Baird and our past board chair. This award honors Mary Ellen's tireless commitment to diversity in the corporate structure as a means to build substantial corporations and a more vital Milwaukee region. 2020 winners included Linda Gorens-Levy and the Wisconsin Energy Corporation Energy Group. Submit your nominees' names to Elmer or Heather at the GMC by January 15th. Milwaukee Women Inc. and the GMC will review nominees and announce the awardee at our next membership meeting on February 8th. And now I'd like to take a moment and introduce Dr. John Raymond, President and CEO of the Medical College of Wisconsin, to share his updated COVID dashboard. Dr. Raymond and the Medical College staff work tirelessly to share accurate and timely COVID updates with our membership and with the region, and we're continuously thankful for your presence at these meetings. Welcome, Dr. Raymond.
Thanks, Julia. Really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for your attention, and Happy New Year. Hopefully 2021 will be better than 2020. I do want to point out that I have a new analytics partner, Ali Namadi, who's joined us. My last two partners actually have, in the spirit of mentorship, have gone on to very, very nice positions at high-profile organizations. So I hope the same thing happens to Ali. If I could have the next slide, please. Just want to summarize where we are just in terms of testing, positive cases, and hospitalizations from COVID-19 in Wisconsin since the beginning of March when COVID-19 came to us. So we've tested 2.9 million individual Wisconsin residents. That's exactly half of our population. Of those, about 507,000 have come back positive. So about 1 in 12 people in Wisconsin have had COVID-19 as diagnosed by PCR testing. Similar numbers in Milwaukee, 464,000 tested, 89,000 positive since the beginning of the pandemic. Just in terms of updating us on where we are, yesterday was a light reporting day with only 1,832 new cases in Wisconsin. It's hard for me to believe that I'm saying that's a light testing day. If you'll recall, back in the summer, we had many, many days when we were below 100. But this is significantly better than our peak that was nearly 8,000 on November 18th. Similar numbers in Milwaukee, only 291 new reported cases yesterday. Our case positivity rate, however, continues to be very high, which suggests that we have a large burden of undiagnosed, probably mildly symptomatic individuals who have COVID-19 in our community. And that's a risk because those individuals are very likely to spread the disease silently throughout our community. And as you can see, our 7-day averages for case positivity also remain over 30%. As I've said before, to put this in perspective, New York City has triggers for increasing stringencies of public and policy interventions at 2, 3, and 5% case positivity. So we have a long way to go. If I could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. I want to talk about hospitalizations. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've had over 22,000 people hospitalized with COVID-19. Only 4.4% of patients diagnosed with COVID-19 have been hospitalized. That's better than the national average and much better than we were seeing early in the pandemic. And there are many reasons for that I've talked about before. But in general, we know much more about how to take care of COVID-19. The number of inpatients now is down under 1,000 for the first time since early November, 999. We're down 70 week over week. As you see, our previous high was almost 2,300, again in the middle of November. Going down further on the left-hand side of the slide, 219 patients in intensive care units. That's down from a high of 456 in the middle of November, but still significantly higher than the numbers we were seeing during the summer. Typically, they were running anywhere between 65 95 patients. ICU capacity, we have 261 immediately available beds. Again, much better than we saw in mid-November when we were down at about 100. And this is for the entire state. So that doesn't really give us a large margin for error. We have plenty of ventilators, 1,900 immediately available. And as I've said before, ventilators will never be a limiting factor in our ability to take care of COVID-19 patients. And as you might expect, even though we're recovering from the recent surge, our PPE supplies, even though they've stabilized, are lower than we'd like them to be, with particular shortages of gowns, goggles, and paper masks. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about outcomes from COVID-19. We now have 93.3% of patients diagnosed with COVID-19 categorized as recovered. And please recall that recovered either means substantial resolution of symptoms or 30 days from diagnosis by PCR. So there are many, many patients who are listed as recovered who have not resumed their pre-infectious state of health. In fact, up to a third of patients who've had COVID-19 have residual and in some cases debilitating persistent symptoms. Right now, only 5.7% of the patients diagnosed with COVID-19 since the beginning of the pandemic are characterized as active. And we have a 1% death rate here. That bumped up a little bit. We were down to 0.8% in October, but as we surged, the death rate went up slightly. That's still better than the US average, which is slightly less than 2%. And I attribute that to the fact that we never had a surge that completely overwhelmed the capacity of our healthcare systems to render the best care to everyone. We came close, though. I want to point out that Aspirus and Marshfield Clinic in central Wisconsin and in Beaver Dam did call in Army Corps of medical experts to help out and staff for a few weeks when we surged and when many of the staff were out either with COVID-19 or with documented exposures. I want to talk about deaths. We passed 5,000 deaths in Wisconsin last week. We're at 5,157 now and approaching 1,000 in Milwaukee at 995. Still a slight predisposition for males and an overrepresentation of Black and African Americans at 7.2% in Wisconsin and 26.5% in Milwaukee. And I would point out that those percentages have continued to improve since the beginning of the pandemic, largely because COVID-19 was spreading silently throughout the rural parts of our state, which are predominantly people that self-identify as Caucasian or white. And when the surge happened there, we largely had the surge under control here in Milwaukee and in other metropolitan areas. Nevertheless, people of color are disproportionately affected by COVID-19 in terms of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. Hispanic and Latinx, 6.1% in Wisconsin, 13% in Milwaukee. I want to go to the right-hand side of the slide just to talk about where we are in terms of trajectory. What I'd like to say is that even though our doubling time is starting to trend favorably, in other words, the longer it takes for the cases to double, the better, that is not the only indicator we need to track. Again, our 7-day growth rate is slightly improving. Lower numbers are better. But I want to point out the reproductive number. It's high. This means that our decline in the surge that we had in October and November is flattening and may actually be starting to reverse. And we have other evidence that I won't show you today from trajectory plots that would suggest that this downward term or deceleration has stopped. So the R number is 1.25 in Wisconsin and 1.14 in Milwaukee. And that tells me that we can't get the vaccines administered fast enough. Next slide, please. I want to talk about vaccines. Most of you already know this, but I just want to give you some estimates of when the vaccines will be available to the public. Currently, we're in phase 1A. That's 21 million people in the US who are either healthcare providers or residents or employees of long-term care facilities like nursing homes. And that's a little under 500,000 here in Wisconsin. Phase 1B, which we actually hope will start near the end of January and perhaps early February, would be frontline essential workers and people over the age of 75 who are likely to have bad outcomes from COVID-19. Now, the CDC defines frontline essential health workers as first responders like firefighters and police, teachers and others in education, food and agriculture workers, including those on the front lines in grocery stores and restaurants, correctional facility staff, postal workers, public transit workers, and some in manufacturing. And that some in manufacturing is likely to be the subject of debate at the state level. Now, in the US, there are 49 million people that fall in phase 1B, and I'm becoming increasingly optimistic that we will be able to ramp up production and distribution of the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, and hopefully we'll have 1 to 3 other players enter the market so that we can go into phase 1C and phase 2 more rapidly than we estimate here. For phase 1C, that would be people ages 65 to 74, other essential workers and people with high-risk medical conditions in the spring. Ideally, that could happen early in March, and then phase 2 by the summer. Next slide, please. Now, I've had a lot of questions about why is it taking so long to get the vaccines out? I want to just start by saying perhaps our expectations for when we would have jabs in arms were probably set too high. But I also want to make sure that people, if you read the article in Forbes that said Wisconsin was behind other states, I actually don't think that's true. There are lags in data, and you have to understand that just because we've had 420,000 doses of vaccines allocated to Wisconsin, and that was as of last Friday, it doesn't mean they're here. 267,000 are categorized as shipped, but that doesn't mean received or distributed to the vaccinators. And then finally, we have administered, and it's documented, nearly 125,000 doses of vaccine to people. So that's a really good start. Now, why are people frustrated? Let me say that the ramp up and the rollout had some hiccups. First of all, our state didn't know how many vaccines we were going to get and when. In many cases, they simply showed up and had to be dealt with in real time. Secondarily, when those were distributed out to the hubs, similar issues with not a lot of advance notice from when the vaccines would be received. And these require security and certification of the hub sites, certification for storage, chain of custody, security, because this is a precious resource, and then the training of your personnel, and you have to have adequate numbers to administer the vaccines. Individuals need to be certified as vaccinators. Then there are reporting and tracking requirements and databases that need to be stood up and accessed. Then there were discussions about prioritization of who fell in category 1A. And because, again, I said we had almost 500,000 people in Wisconsin in category 1A and only 266,000 doses shipped, that each individual hub had to make decisions about prioritizing who would get the vaccine first. And then simple things like, for example, in our emergency department, we chose not to vaccinate every person at the same time. As you know, both of these vaccines can cause headaches, fevers, fatigue, and muscle aches that might cause someone not to report to work. And we didn't want that to happen with everybody at the same time in the same unit. So for those logistical reasons, in some cases, doses were held back for those very, very frontline providers so that they wouldn't all be vaccinated at the same time. Then there are logistical issues of storage, accessibility, safety. When you're trying to immunize people, you can't pack people into a stadium and safely socially distance, maintain masks, and the chain of custody of the vaccine. Also because of the side effect of severe allergic reactions, which happen in about 10 out of 1 million cases, every vaccination site had to have post-vaccination observation areas, which slowed down the throughput. So I could go to the next slide. I'll just conclude. These are a list of some of the data sources that we use for these presentations. With that, I'll turn it back over to Julia.
Thank you, Dr. Raymond. This is David Lubar, and thank you for continuing to share your insights. Last year, the GMC hosted 15 membership meetings, including 13 during the pandemic, and you gave us thoughtful and helpful updates at all 13 of those meetings. So again, thank you. And thank you for explaining much more about the vaccine rollout process, and we definitely are anxious to hear more as it continues. I'd now like to introduce today's keynote speaker, Bob Feldman. Bob is Vice Chair of ICF Next, a global consulting firm, and founder of the Dialogue Project and the project's lead corporate sponsor. The Dialogue Project is a global study of how business can improve civil discourse and reduce polarization in our society. Case studies and available data show disturbing trends in Americans' deteriorating ability to debate difficult issues. However, there are also promising new initiatives within the business world, which we will hear about, and which have the support of companies such as Google, Bristol-Myers Squibb, Chevron, Hewlett Packard, Southwest Airlines, as well as University of Southern California. Following Bob, we will hear from Tara Leweling, Vice President of Allstate Insurance, in a panel discussion that includes Peggy Troy, President and CEO of Children's Hospital, Jennifer Bartolotta, President of Bartolotta and Associates, and Chris Miskel, President and CEO of Versiti and the BloodCenter of Wisconsin. Please join me in welcoming Bob Feldman.
David, thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to you and Julie and everyone for inviting me. Special thanks to Joanne Bishman, my friend, the former Chief Communications Officer at Harley-Davidson, for getting me involved. I do appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. The genesis of this program, the Dialogue Project, started a little over a year ago. It was September of 2019. I had to give a speech to a large group of communications executives and decided to focus on the issue of polarization and discourse because no surprise, I thought, like many people have, it's a big problem. And two, speaking to a room full of communicators, I thought the core issue here, the fundamental challenge we face is one of communication and understanding. So in any case, I gave these remarks back in September, and then frankly, in drafting the remarks, I kind of concluded that talk is cheap. Maybe rather than just giving a speech, we should do something about it. So I used that speech as really the opportunity to kick off this program that we called the Dialogue Project. And I'm going to take you through it, but in sum, it's a program, basically a large research effort to understand, examine, and help support what the role of business in improving civil discourse and reducing polarization. There are a number of organizations, there are many people working on polarization and discourse. This had the specific approach of taking a look, what is the role and responsibility of business? Many of you may be familiar with Alan Murray's writings. Alan is the CEO of Fortune Media. He's the former editor-in-chief of Fortune magazine. And Alan recently kind of mentioned, and my comment here has to do with what's the role of business. Alan recently mentioned that, you know, for Gen Z and millennials, which make up a very large percentage of our workforce these days, unlike generations prior, there are certain trends that are impacting them as it relates to discourse and polarization. One is this constituency tends not to be as involved in their religious organizations as prior generations. Two, they tend not to be involved in civic institutions as prior generations. Three, they tend to get married a little bit later. And four, whereas many of them spend an awful lot of time on social media, those environments are sometimes as problematic as they are kind of helpful in terms of creating communities, particularly communities that reflect some degree of diversity. As we all know, unfortunately, we all tend to live in bubbles. Alan's point of all of that, and a big point of the Dialogue Project, is that given that dynamic with so much of the employee population around this country, there is a particular role for business to play in helping people to understand what their role is in society, how to improve discourse, how to reduce polarization. And all of this is happening at the same time, as I'm sure many of you are familiar, over the last 2 or 3 years, you've seen trends like, for example, the Business Roundtable talking about the importance of corporations to their various stakeholders, not only shareholders. Larry Fink of BlackRock talking about purpose-driven corporations, their contribution to society and how they will invest. You've seen just in the last 2 or 3 years, forget about the last week, we'll talk about that in a second, but you've seen in the last 2 or 3 years a growing demand for chief executives and companies to speak out on issues that previously they didn't really want to speak out on. I think those issues that they're getting pushed to talk on are largely issues relevant to their business. The pressure on them is often coming disproportionately from their employee population, who want their companies to take a stand, to stand for something. This gets back to purpose-driven. It also gets back to the Gen Z millennial employee population segment that really wants to hold their employers accountable for values, beliefs, and understanding what does this company stand for. So the point of this whole kind of introduction, if you will, is that all of these dynamics are taking place that are placing a greater responsibility on business to stand up and help improve society. And the good news is, I think you're seeing, as I mentioned, whether it's the Business Roundtable, the US Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, you're seeing many, many business groups actively embrace this role. And I think that's a very positive thing. So that is kind of the backdrop to the Dialogue Project. What I want to do is I'm going to take you onto the actual website, give you some insight of some of the findings, because I think a lot of it is actionable. The intent of the Dialogue Project is to educate and inspire business leaders to make contributions to improving discourse or reducing polarization. So the question, you might be asking is, okay, well, maybe I'm interested, but how? And that was kind of the point of this program that we developed over the past year. It's to give you some ideas, examples, insight into how businesses are thinking, what they're doing. And hopefully you might look at some of this and say, we can do something like that, or maybe we could take that idea and adapt it to be what's relevant to us. So with that, hopefully that all makes sense. And then afterwards, I'm going to have Tara Leweling, who David mentioned before. Tara is a vice president with Allstate, to do a little bit of a deep dive on something they're doing that's featured in the Dialogue Project that I think you'll find really fascinating. And then we'll go to a panel. So I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully I think everybody can see this. This is the kind of website. It's live right now about the Dialogue Project. The website, the URL is dialogueproject.study, as you can see at the top. What the Dialogue Project basically did was took a look in 3 major categories of information. I'll drill down in a moment. You'll see here research. We worked with Morning Consult to do a global study on this issue of the problems of polarization and discourse. What can business do based on the recommendations of the population at large? So we interviewed 1,000 people in the United States, 1,000 people in the UK, 1,000 in Germany, Brazil, and India. And we have the quantitative data there that kind of makes the case, indicates the severity of the problem, and starts to indicate or hint at some solutions. Over on the right side, under perspectives, I'll take you through that. We have byliners from a number of thought leaders who I'll kind of take you through. And then in case studies over here, we have some really great examples of work being done by companies. So let me start with just first going into the research and what some of the key findings are. I would really encourage you, if you can, to find some time in the next week or so, take 15 or 20 minutes and spend some time with the website, because there's a lot of content here. And obviously in the time we have today, I can't go through, anywhere near the majority of it. But what I hope to do is kind of inspire you to maybe want to come back and kind of read this. So here are some of the key findings from the Morning Consult research. One, a bad situation is getting worse, and obviously this was done even before the events of last week. By a nearly 2-to-1 margin, Americans said it's now more difficult to have respectful dialogue with those who hold differing views on COVID and Black Lives Matter. In other words, as a consequence, after COVID, after Black Lives Matter, the capacity to have respectful conversations got even worse. And that puts us at the bottom of the list. I mentioned we researched 5 countries, UK, Germany, Brazil, and India. We came in dead last on this. Here's another finding. The headline I put was, this is why we talk about the weather. Across countries, politics, race, and sexual orientation are the 3 hardest subjects to have constructive conversations about with people who hold differing views. And in the US, gun laws made it to number 3. We just really have a very, very hard time talking with people who have differing views. Now take a look at this finding. We know what needs to be done, we just need to do it. Will people engage and listen? Well, 82% of the people said we should be more respectful when talking with those with different views. But only 50% said they should spend more time doing so, and only a quarter said they actually do. So we kind of know what needs to get done, but it seems as though we're not really willing to do it. Solving it won't be easy. We asked, what do we need to do to solve this problem? People said elect leaders who inspire people to be more civil, reform news to emphasize more fair and balanced coverage, and reform elections by improving transparency in the campaign and reporting process. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. And then the last quantitative piece I wanted to share with you is culture plays a role. Number 1, in the United States, women think polarization is a substantially bigger problem than men, interestingly. That's a pretty meaningful differential there. You see 63 to 51%. And the US is considerably more similar to Brazil and India than it is to the UK and Germany in terms of how many people think polarization is a major problem. In Brazil, it's 2/3, and it's 57% in the US, 49% in India. So a large percentage of the population think it's a big problem, as opposed to in the UK and in Germany. So we know we have a big problem. So what do we do about it? So what I wanted to do here is share with you some perspectives. We approached any number of business leaders, primarily in the US, not exclusively, but primarily for their perspectives. You see Joanne Jenkins, the CEO of AARP. Here you see, I'll drill down on a few of these. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. And Jamie's, one of the things that impressed me with the contributions many of these people offered to the Dialogue Project. And this, what they wrote was written exclusively for the Dialogue Project. I thought was, quite candid and important and so forth. Here's a part from Jamie's thing. It is clear that partisan politics is stopping collaborative policy from being implemented, particularly at the federal level. This is not some special economic malaise we're in. This is about our society. We are unwilling to compromise. We are unwilling or unable to create good policy based on deep analytics, and our government is unable to reorganize and keep pace in the new world. Plain and simple, this is a collective failure to put the needs of society ahead of our personal, parochial, and partisan interests. If we do not fix these problems, America's moral, economic, and military dominance may cease to exist. I mean, I thought that was pretty, candid and powerful. Here's one of someone many of you may know. Catherine Gale wrote a terrific piece. Catherine, as you may know now, is the founder of the Institute for Political Innovation. She recently wrote a book with Michael Porter of the Harvard Business School that is basically on what they call Final Five voting. So, what she said here, there are really perverse incentives in our country today that politics lack any sense of real competition. The rules of the game, as she wrote here, in politics reward rigid ideology over practical solutions and legislative gridlock over national interest. Partisanship pays, compromise costs. So how do we fix this? So they wrote a whole book about free market politics, and basically the book was called The Politics Industry. But you see here, our work illuminated how American politics is a nation crippling perversion of competition. It also lit the way forward through the adoption of free market concepts that encourage new ideas and new candidates from the fringes to the mainstream. And she talks about Final Five voting, which basically is nonpartisan primaries and the top 5 candidates running the general election with the top 5 and it's ranked choice voting. I encourage you to read this. I think it's a really terrific piece. I'll give you some other examples. Mary Barra, the CEO of General Motors, wrote a terrific piece on the importance of listening, and not just from a cliche standpoint, but how in her organization they've really taught people how to listen and to do it actively and deeply. Gary Kelly is the CEO of Southwest Airlines. Gary wrote a terrific piece, and again, I mentioned earlier, really candid commentary. It must not be lost on any of us that the Civil War was fought for the freedom of Black slaves 150 years ago. We've come a long way, but not nearly far enough. And the Black Lives Matter racial injustice movement today should teach us all that we clearly have not learned and fully embraced the lessons of our dark past. And you know, there are so many good ones. Maybe I'll read just one more. Sally Sussman is an executive vice president with Pfizer, and so I'll take you down here in terms of kind of an action. She said, you know, Pfizer has more work to do in terms of what they could do to help improve discourse or reduce polarization. But here are 4 things they're doing, and you may want to think about this kind of thing. One is speak out externally. I mean, they get active on issues that are important to the company. They speak out, they don't hide. 2, they often join with others, whether it's the Partnership for New York City, the Business Roundtable, whatever. 3, contribute to further change. The company Pfizer, as well as their foundation, make significant contributions to organizations that are advocating the kind of change they want to see. And finally, amend the PAC bylaws. So there's been a lot of discussion lately about contributing to, you know, who companies are contributing to based on what's going on in the world. So this is an example of what they're doing. There's so many great perspectives here. I really kind of encourage you to read it when you have a chance. And then case studies. We have here about 20 examples of some really interesting case studies from some companies doing innovative work. I'm actually going to have Tara from Allstate talk about that in a minute. I'll just highlight one other. General Mills up in Minneapolis does an amazing program called Courageous Conversations. They're based in Minneapolis, but it's a global program where they bring all of their employees together purely on a voluntary basis to talk about really difficult issues. They'll tackle race relations, police brutality, immigration, LGBTQ issues, and so forth. Typically, the program lasts 90 minutes. The first 30 minutes, a speaker talks who has some expertise on the subject. And then in the remaining hour, they break out into small groups of 10. Obviously, it's now done all virtually. They've trained well over 100 people in the company to be able to facilitate those dialogues. And it's all about helping people learn how to respect and hear the other side. So here again, there are so many great examples here. I would encourage you to spend some time on the website and read that. So hopefully a lot of that starts to kind of make sense. I will say the dialogue project itself has fortunately received a considerable amount of attention. Again, if you go to the site, you'll see a lot of news stories. The Financial Times, you'll see here the Harvard Business Review, as an example, ran a piece that I wrote about the dialogue project, particularly around Election Day. And in light of the events of the past week, what could be more important than trying to facilitate and enhance the level of understanding that our people have of one another, so we can have constructive, productive dialogue and not have these issues go to such extremes. And a great example of that for deep dive is the work that Allstate is doing with the Aspen Institute. So I'm going to ask Tara, if she would, to take a little bit of time and share with you this really great example. And again, maybe it'll inspire you and your own organizations to think, well, maybe there's something we could do that's a little bit like this, or something on our own, but it's a great goal and a great outcome. So Tara, if you would, take it away.
Great, thanks, Bob. And we really appreciate being profiled in the the Dialogue Project. I'm just going to talk to you for a few minutes today about the Better Arguments Project. As Bob noted, it's a partnership that we have with the Aspen Institute and a longstanding partner as well, the Facing History and Ourselves, which does a lot of education at helping people become upstanders rather than bystanders by educating them about civil rights, Holocaust history, and denoting that difference between what what do communities look like and what does society looks like when people stand up rather than stand by. A little bit of history around the project. Starting in 2016, right after the election, Eric Liu at the Aspen Institute made the observation in an article in the Atlantic that 50% of America, or roughly 50% of America, was going to be unhappy with the results of the 2016 election. And I think we've seen the same with the 2020 election. Again, a close election. And again, 50% of America, when you go by the popular vote, disappointed with the outcome. And so Eric was musing what can be done in order to help our country overcome the polarization that exists in society, help our country reach across differences and engage with each other in a different way. As we know, the polls are just, they're getting more extreme rather than less extreme when you think about the center of mass in terms of politics in the country. And so Eric published this article in the Atlantic. He's at the Aspen Institute, and so we were looking at that. We have this longstanding relationship with Facing History, and from this partnership was born this idea that part of the solution could be that rather than burying our arguments or pretending they don't exist, we needed to equip communities and individuals to be able to argue better. Let's talk about our arguments. Rather than bury them, let's surface them and understand that we do differ, that we do have different points of view, and we need to be able to engage with each other. Now, as Bob pointed out, that 82% agree that it should be done, 50% might be willing to do it, and 25% are willing to do it. What we're trying to do is create the tools to help move that 25% closer to the 82% that say that it should be done. So we worked on this with Aspen, with Facing History, and tried to figure out what does it actually mean for our community to argue better. I mean, it sounds fantastic in theory, but what does it actually look like? And with that, we came up with, by engaging across society with academics, with business leaders, with frontline employees, with community groups, with civic groups, with faith leaders, came up with what we are calling the 5 principles of a better argument. It says if you want to argue better, there are 5 principles that sit underneath that. One of them is understanding history. Another is making room to transform, of understanding that any conversation you go into can be an opportunity to learn something, can be an opportunity to change yourself if you come into it with that mindset. And so we spent a good amount of time thinking about what does arguing better look like. And then with this theory and with these 5 principles, started thinking about, well, what does it really look like if we take this theory and test it in practice and bring it to communities? So we held 2 events, one in Denver, focused on tech boom tensions, and basically the growing tech center in Denver, creating challenges with affordable housing, with equitable employment, where local people were not necessarily getting the jobs that were coming with the tech sector coming into their area. And we also went to Detroit, which also, as we all know, has a long and proud history, but also has been a place where economic disinvestment happened for many decades and economic investment is now restarting. But there's a lot of tension with that economic reinvestment and a lot of trust that needs to be built with people who stayed throughout the entirety of Detroit's decline and now want to make sure that the people who are coming and investing are really in it to stay in Detroit and invest in Detroit over the long term. And we had an overwhelming response to those 2 events where we were trying to test these principles in practice. It was incredibly engaging. I often say when I was in Detroit as part of this conversation, I felt like in 3 hours I learned, I experienced so much of Detroit's complicated but very proud history. And we realized we were really onto something. Well, fast forward, the pandemic starts to hit, and we realize we need to translate this into a virtual environment. And we also wanted to figure out, now that we've tested it in theory and tested it in practice, could we scale it? So this past September, after almost 2 years of dedicated work, we launched what's called the Better Arguments Project. And you can find it on betterarguments.org. It's a partnership, as I said, with Aspen and with Facing History. And what we're trying to do is equip individuals, equip communities to have better arguments. So we have toolkits that communities can use to learn about the principles of a better argument and even practice them. We have one, for example, from middle schools where young people can learn to argue, like, is cake or ice cream better? So really learning those principles. We have a toolkit for in the workplace, thinking about those social issues that are complicated and people don't always see eye to eye on. How can you create an environment where people can talk about those and engage in the workplace? And also in communities, how can civic groups hold discussions that reach across difference, engage across difference? For example, liberty versus liberty and individual freedom versus investing in community and community outcomes is another tension in our society. And then we're also, through Aspen, providing trainings on all of this, where individuals or civic leaders, business leaders can learn more about the principles of a better argument, can learn more about how to bring it into their organizations, and just understand, like, what does it actually look like to engage across difference? What does it take in order for that to work effectively and for people to be in the mindset where that can actually take place and the engagement can be rewarding and productive for everyone who's participating. So I know we're a bit over time, so I'll close it there, but I welcome any questions. We're in 10,000 communities across America. There are all state agencies in nearly every community in America. And the reason we got involved in this is we saw how polarization was tearing communities apart. And so we really wanted to think about what we could do, being so connected to communities across America. And this was one of the ideas that we came up with how to try and tackle this polarization that exists and move from, as Bob pointed out, that 25% that's doing something to the 82% that think that we need to be doing something.
Tara, thanks. I want to follow up and ask you a quick question, but I also want to thank Peggy, Chris, and Jennifer for joining the panel, because we're going to now have a good discussion. And I also would encourage everybody who's watching this to feel free to ask questions in the Q&A section, and we'll take some discussion as well. But before we kind of get to the panel, Tara, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, the program is just such an amazing program that you're doing with Aspen, but I guess the obvious question in some respects is why? I mean, I don't know that you could track sales to it and so forth. It's a big commitment by the company. Thank you for doing it. But, what's the motivation to do it? Why are you spending the kind of time and money that you are on this kind of work?
No, it's a great question. Part of it comes from our culture. We're a very civic-minded company. And so we encourage, for example, our employees to be deeply engaged in the civic process. We have a really strong, for example, we had a really strong program last year around the census, around getting out the vote and encouraging employees to be engaged. We expect all of our officers, our VPs and above, to participate on a nonprofit in their community. We encourage volunteerism, which Bring Out the Good Month. So partly it's ingrained in our culture. But the other piece of it, which is closer to the business, and as you point, this isn't about sales, this is about helping the country, is we have agents in nearly every community in America. So while we are a national brand and a national business, in fact, a global business with talent centers in many different countries, we are really, at the end of the day, it's our agents who are engaging in communities at that local level that is driving our business. And so partly we wanted to equip those leaders, and we expect agents to be leaders in their communities. We expect them to invest in their communities and stand up in their communities, equip them with tools so that they could do that, so they could bring this to the civic groups that they're a part of, bring it to the schools that their customers' children might be attending, and really have this opportunity to lead and engage in their communities. We're just one of those companies where we're so connected to our customers and we're so connected to communities across America that when we see a problem, we really feel compelled to act. And as we saw the growing polarization across the country, we were just profoundly compelled to act and think about what could we do from a company perspective in partnership with others who have deep experience on this to help move the needle so that we can actually restore a certain amount of civic engagement in the country, but civic engagement that's steeped in reaching across, not just hunkering down and staying within our different parts of the political spectrum.
Thank you, Tara. You know, one point I do want to make as we kind of get into the panel conversation is this is not intended in any way to be a conversation about politics. You know, what it is a conversation intended to be what can we do to help people learn how to have more productive dialogue, reduce on any issue. It could be a business issue, it could be a political issue, it could be, I mean, the applications are widespread. So, you know, that's why I thought, you know, the events of last week are disturbing. I don't want, you know, this isn't the place to talk about the events of last week per se, but it only, you know, underscored once again, there is a big divide in this country and there is a need to learn how to kind of, you know, forget about the extremes, but, you know, for people who really just have a hard time kind of understanding the other side, that's where the need is. So and I'm really hoping that the people who are, you know, listening today, that we kind of push them a little bit and really think about, you know what, maybe it is an opportunity and there is a need for business to kind of maybe, you know, even do a little bit more. So let me start with this. I'll start a question, maybe Peggy, I'm going to ask you to kind of start and we'll kind of maybe do a quick round robin. And I'm going to say, let's first start macro. If you would just share your thoughts on the overall focus of today's session, meaning, you know, what role do you believe business should play in terms of helping to reduce polarization and discourse? And then maybe we can go from there. So Peggy, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, so thank you so much. And thanks, Bob and Tara. Very interesting presentation. I do think that business has a huge opportunity to reduce polarization. I think it's a really important part. We are the leaders of the community. We are the ones that are the voices for many that we serve. I think that the way you go about it, in my estimation, is that the companies have to look internally. And first and foremost, my opinion is that the CEO needs to look at themselves and to make sure that they're in touch with their conscious bias, with their North Star, with how they believe the world needs to behave. And then we talk a lot at Children's about the shadow of leadership. And that's something that then you, as an individual, as a leader in an organization, have to role model for the rest of your employees and to design a culture in your organization that allows for that discord, that allows for a good conversation. We started a culture work about in 2012, and we talked about a lot of really important issues, starting with the shadow of leadership, levels of accountability, levels of listening, assuming positive intent, start with being curious as opposed to always coming up with your own opinion and biased about things, and then have a level of appreciation and gratitude for individuals. We're in a unique business in that we serve kids. Kids don't vote. And so we are in a position that we've got to be their voice, to advocate for them. And when you get into levels of polarization, it's really important that you recognize your North Star, stick to your North Star, but then help encourage the organization to evolve. I will tell you, between COVID, racism, and the political discord that's occurred, this has been a very difficult year for all of us as CEOs. But I think that we have to step back and look at the position and our role. I think Milwaukee's an amazing community. We have an opportunity to shape and influence our community. We have to do that through collective impact and make sure that we are speaking and having the right kinds of conversations, being open, being honest, using the principles of crucial conversations so that we can get to the right solutions to make Milwaukee the best place to be.
Great. Thank you, Peggy. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. And I've got to tell you, this is one of the better sessions just in terms of causing me to reflect. And I think the resources you guys are providing are fantastic to push our thinking. So appreciate you joining us. You know, for us, we start with our purpose. So I think where I am is really similar to what Peggy said. As a community-based organization, so we're here to serve the community. We're the leading blood provider in the area. And we can't do it alone. And we know that the folks that we interact with that are selfless enough to partner with us, they come in all kind of shapes and sizes and walks of life with different views. So for us, we focus on how we can make really deep human connections And I think to do that, you've got to have a little bit of an anthropologist mindset, right? Where you're constantly looking to learn about people and be able to find common ground. So, we can't do what we want to do as an organization without cultivating an environment that respects diversity and inclusion and sustainability for our employees and for our donor base. And so we're constantly looking at how we can tailor our interactions and how we can listen to make sure that we keep people engaged around what we do.
Thank you, Chris. Jennifer?
Good afternoon. Bob and Tara, it was really compelling and provocative, and I'm sort of in your space a little bit, Bob. I work with companies as opposed to running one where this is deployed, and I'm in Peggy's camp. Do I think businesses have a responsibility to do this? No. Do I think it's a huge opportunity for businesses? Absolutely. When you take a look at human beings pre-pandemic, social isolationism was a huge topic. And if you follow people in mental health today, almost many notable people in the mental health arena will tell you that after we're through that COVID pandemic, we are going to bump up against a mental health pandemic globally. And so when our employees feel like they're heard and that they matter and that they belong, and when we can create an environment for them to be able to participate safely, then you have productive teams, which results in a culture that will help you attract and maintain the greatest talent in your field. And so I think that if you are a business leader, you face a huge opportunity to engage in this conversation and find ways that are culturally congruent to your company to deploy it.
Let me ask a question, if I could, see what you guys think. One of the challenges for some companies, Peggy said at the beginning, I think you need CEOs who have a certain level of self-awareness and are introspect, they understand what's required. But historically, I don't know if that's the right word, but traditionally, let's say, some of these issues, whether it's race, immigration, LGBTQ, some of the issues that are creating difficulty having conversations are the very things that many CEOs grew up learning to avoid at all costs. Like it was the third rail of the business world. Like, don't, whatever you do, don't. And now things have shifted. How much of that do you think is an issue? How much do you think it's an issue that CEOs are still quite anxious about having conversations on subjects that can be polarizing? Peggy, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think it's still a big issue. I think that we have gone through a learning journey here at Children's with our inclusion, diversity, and equity undertakings because we weren't having those kinds of conversations. Now, interestingly enough, when you think about the population of kids that we serve, we get all walks of life. We're here to serve the community. Our doors are open to everybody. And so we have those issues that present themselves within our own organization. And we've recently started really talking to our employees about, okay, what does this mean? How do you feel about this? How do we have the level of dialogue and discord available to you so you can express your opinions and views? But I will tell you that's a new skill that we all have to undertake, and we have to be open-minded. And again, I think I'm going to go back to, you've got to start with yourself. If you're a servant leader, you're going to look at yourself in the mirror. You're going to understand your own conscious bias. You're going to have to really understand your clear motives, your personal accountability, how you set up an environment that's not a win-lose. As I mentioned before, you have to stay curious. But the most important thing, and Bob, you said this, is really listening to understand. Again, because we show up with this because of wherever our walks of life have been in our past, we show up with this and to try to get your arms around that. And until you are willing to be vulnerable, you're not going to engage your organization in a way in which they're going to feel that they have the permission to be honest and truthful. And I'm on that journey myself.
Yeah. It's kind of funny. I do often talk with people about this whole, listening thing, and not more often, but very often, people don't really listen. What they do is they just wait for the other person to stop talking so that they, And I try to say to, and often say to people, what do you think the odds are that you're going to convert somebody to a different way of thinking in this kind? Like when was the last time that happened to you, right? So if the odds of it are pretty slim, why not at least take advantage of the opportunity to rather listen and try to learn that perspective? Because the odds of you successfully getting somebody to change a point of view or an opinion at this stage is probably kind of pretty modest. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, following Peggy's not easy because I tend to agree with her. I think we've got a similar mindset here. 20 years ago, I would say that authenticity and vulnerability probably were not talked about. When you got your management 101, not that it was invisible, but when you got trained on what to do, for sure, you're looking for the places that create controversy, and you're looking to stay away from those things. So I think you nailed it. Hey, that there are certain topics that I'll just tell you the way that I was trained coming up. There were certain things that weren't as appropriate, and you're very mindful of that as you go through your leadership journey. And I think it does take a little bit of, it takes humility. I think it takes trust that you've built an ecosystem of people that are like-minded. So I think Peggy was talking about leadership and the leader's journey, but I think you've got to, take time to kind of get into the next layer of the organization, the next layer of the organization, and then you kind of get this multiplier effect that you can't get overnight. But over time, we do prioritize humility and vulnerability now. But I'll tell you, some of these issues of 2020, they're exhausting and they're challenging, and it's just hard. And most humans, when most folks have probably been through crucial conversations training. Not a lot of people want to get in a bunch of crucial conversations, right? When you wake up and you're fired up for your day and you're thinking about, hey, where are the places that are the biggest engagers? It's doing great things to help people and to support folks and see them flourish. And so naturally, most people aren't going to want to spend a lot of time in this zone. And so that's what makes it hard. I think you have to facilitate the dialogue in spots, but then help people see a bigger purpose and why it's important, and then link it back to, hey, for our organization, here's what we're trying to accomplish. And these conversations are really, really important, because if we can't have dialogue on these kinds of issues, we can't get to our true north.
Tara, when you have these community conversations, you get into some pretty serious stuff. And, it's your name on the banner, if you will. Does that make it uncomfortable for the company? Does that make it uncomfortable for your people?
It's something we've had a lot of dialogue about. And in fact, we probably had some better arguments about how to do better arguments, and Allstate participate in them. I agree with Chris. It starts with having a really strong purpose as a company. And when our current CEO came into the chair around the time of the financial crisis, he led us on a journey to define our purpose and define our North Star as a company. And that has created a culture that enables us to have those conversations. At the same time, there are certain things that, we would encourage communities to talk about, but maybe the Allstate brand might not show up in all those conversations. We certainly encourage it, believe in the 5 principles of a better argument, use those principles to have that conversation, but it does get complicated. I mean, our customer base represents the diversity of America. Our employees represent the diversity of America. There are hot button things. At the same time, we think we've hit upon a methodology that enables, if people come into the room in the right mindset, they may come into the room with that willingness to transform, you can talk about nearly anything. But we are being very judicious about the toolkits that we create in partnership with Aspen and Facing History and make available versus what communities may want to create on their own and abide by the principles as they create those.
I want to ask a question that may be open to anyone. And that is, I want to kind of take this from this may be the right thing to do, a nice thing to do, it's good for America, yada, 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 and come back to the problem and maybe why it's more of a need than it is you know, a number of us have said it's, you know, more it's an opportunity, and I agree it's an opportunity, but I'm also thinking maybe it's also a need. So my question is this: what impact has this kind of polarization and partisanship and difficulty to have conversations with people over the last several years? What impact is that having on business, whether it's your business or business in general? You know, what's the big problem? Yeah, okay, fine, it's not a good thing, but is it really impacting business?
I think, I'm just going to answer that. I think more and more businesses are being asked to be accountable to these things. And in fact, there's a big movement across the country now for publicly traded companies to embrace the concepts of environment, society, and governance, to make sure that they are, as a company, practicing in a way in which embraces the tenets of having a workforce and a place where people want to work, and products then that meet the market demands. And I think more and more choices are about which companies you want to work with are going to be made on how they're perceived relative to some of these concepts. So I think, first of all, you know, your product is your workforce. You've got to have the workforce in your organization that can carry out your mission. We need people that really want to come and take care of kids across all walks of life. But then I also think that people are willing to invest in me through philanthropy and contributions because they know that I am very conscientious about making sure that we are a company of respect and carry out our good purpose, live according to our North Star, but also are really good as community citizens as well. It's one thing to be engaged in your own company, but then how you show up and create that collective impact in the community, I think is very important. So I do, Bob, think this is becoming a factor that whether it could affect your stock prices or your workforce, it's important for companies to embrace this.
I think people are thirsting for something that they can believe in. And I think when, what's the big deal for business? I think when leaders are not walking the talk, employees are more and more sensing that and resistant to that. You know, I had read an article, I don't know whether or not it's true, but I had read an article that Twitter largely permanently suspended the president's Twitter account because of pushback from their employee base. You know, we spend a third of our time at work. And if we want teams that are going to be productive, we have to create an environment where they want to be. And, you know, if you do KPIs, and turnover is one of those KPIs that you study, turnover is one of the most costly things to an organization, regardless of why it happens. And so increasingly, I think people, you know, we want to belong somewhere. We want to be, what happened last week is horrific, but part of why it happened was the social isolationism where people desperately need to feel like they belong somewhere. And it just makes so much sense to me that work is the place that you want to belong. Work needs to become like Cheers, right? Where everybody matters, where everybody knows your name, where you can have discourse. I love this idea about the argument, right? But you got to show up wanting to do the work. And so I think you do that as a leader by meeting people where they are. You know, Peggy, you mentioned the word vulnerability, and I think that that's a very uncomfortable word for leaders. We're not used to it. But when we can, if you change vulnerability to humanity, and Peggy, you showed up at work today and said to your leadership team, I'm having a bad day. I need you to lift me today. Think about how that filters down. So maybe the word for leaders needs to be humanity and not vulnerability, because I think vulnerability can have negative connotations to it. And so if the leader is human and you show your humanity, then that is going to filter down into the organization, and you're going to be able to create a place of trust where real productivity and great teamwork can happen.
Chris, what do you think? I mean, is the problem a business problem?
Yeah, I think it is, for many of the reasons that Peggy and Jennifer outlined. And maybe the only thing I would add is that the creativity, like, you don't want to leave something on the table within your team. And if folks aren't feeling like, if there's something that's in the way of trust, or if there's something in the way of them bringing their whole self to work, then you might miss an opportunity to connect with the folks that you need to connect with to serve. And so that's where we come at it from, is can folks bring their whole self to work? Are we facilitating contemporary conversations? And how do you make sure that you're not missing an opportunity to develop someone or to create understanding amongst a team so that they can be as high performing as they should be?
So let me ask you a question, and maybe this will be the final question to each of you, if you could do it in 30 seconds or so apiece. If you're in an organization, and we have a lot of people with us today, if you're in an organization, whether you're leading it or you're part of the leadership team, and you're just not sure, getting engaged in this is a good idea. It's like, I kind of get it intellectually, but we have a lot of priorities. It just makes me nervous. I'm not really sure what the best first step is to, put my toe in the water or to start to engage in this kinds of social dialogue that I haven't done before for my organization. What advice would you have in terms of just how to get started, how to do it in a way that's comfortable and authentic to the company? So we'll just do a quick round robin. Peggy, what do you think?
First, I'm going to go back to get in touch with your own feelings. I think if you've got a great leadership team, you need to really, again, and Jennifer, thank you so much for saying humanity, because I think you've got to offer yourself up as a human being, and we're going through that right now. And I think that, if you think that those conversations aren't occurring in your company and people are recognizing your unwillingness to address these issues, you're not in touch with what's going on with your workforce, because the conversations are happening. They're all over the place. You just need to figure out a process and deliver on it. And know that you're not going to get it right 100% of the time. I think that's the other thing that people need to know. It's not perfect. You have to go, it's not a destination, it's a journey.
Tara?
I think what I would add is, at least in our business, reputation is everything. And so you have to constantly be thinking about what are your stakeholders expecting right now, and have a process for getting that data so you understand it. So you're meeting expectations, because as you meet expectations, it builds trust, it creates strong reputation, and it drives competitive advantage. But if you don't know what your stakeholders are thinking and expecting, not just your employees, but all your stakeholders, then you're at a real disadvantage as a company.
Thanks. Chris?
Yeah, I would underscore all of what's been said, and I would also just say, what's the risk of inaction? And sometimes reflecting on, sometimes today it doesn't look like, the line's constantly moving on certain things. And so what might have been appropriate a year ago or 3 years ago or 5 years ago in a certain environment and context, it may no longer be the appropriate action. And so inaction could actually be worse. And I would just say, get out and talk to people at all levels of the organization and get a sense of what the fabric is of the organization.
Great point. I'm in the communications business. We often tell people, no comment is a very loud comment. Okay.
Sure.
Inaction is an action. All right. Great point. Jennifer?
Sorry. I spent Saturday afternoon taking a Braver Angels workshop called Depolarizing Within. And if you're not familiar with it, to you leaders, Peggy, to your point of analyzing, sometimes it's hard to analyze with only your blinders on. And so this was an incredibly well moderated session where you had to analyze your polarization. And this is one of those kind of guesses, but I would guess that 75% of the 120 people on the call left that call and our interactions after spending the afternoon together, recognizing that they had a lot of work to do as it related to where they stood on certain things. And so if you're not aware of Braver Angels, they ask for a donation, but it's free. And I would highly recommend, it's called Depolarizing from Within. And they regularly host sessions that are virtual in all parts of the country.
Thank you. Thank you. Great idea. And it was a great conversation. I mean, we could go on and on. One of the things somebody mentioned to me a long time ago, and it's very true, is the workplace is one of the very few places where you go, virtual or otherwise, and you are with people from different backgrounds and perspectives. We all tend to live in bubbles, and work is really one of the few places where you're exposed to that. And I think that adds another level of both opportunity and responsibility for business leaders to make a difference. So great conversation. I encourage people who are kind of watching to, go to betterarguments.org, go to dialogueproject.study, check out Better Angels that Jennifer's talking about. There's a lot of great stuff out there, and I just encourage people to kind of, figure out what's right for you and right for your company. And if you haven't, just kind of get started. So thank you very much. And with that, David, I will turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Tara. Thank you, panelists. I think this has been very productive to show what business can do, what business leaders can do. There are lots of business leaders on this phone call. And to be able to take it from a topic that many people think can only be addressed on a personal level to what a corporation can do to lead the way, because I think we all know we do need to reduce polarization in this country. So thank you again for your time, your knowledge, sharing the research, and all your insights. So with that, this meeting is concluding, and our next GMC meeting is February 8th. It will be a Zoom call again, and it will feature Rob Henkin and Jason Stein with the Wisconsin Policy Forum. We'll be talking about local revenue sharing and the budget for the state of Wisconsin. So thank you, everyone. Have a good week, and the meeting is now adjourned.